Welcome to Australia's Environment in 2020. In this video, we'll give you an overview of environmental conditions across Australia in the year 2020. We've summarised a large amount of satellite station and survey data, and we've interpreted and reported that using our WALD system. We've augmented that with data from Australian and overseas agencies. A national summary report and report cards for all regions are available at www.ausan.online. In this video, we'll cover the following topics. We'll talk about global change, oceans, people, weather, fire, water, soils, vegetation, biodiversity, and finally, we look at the number of summary indicators for different states and territories. Atmospheric CO2 continued to rise in 2020. Concentrations increased by 2.3 parts per million. That is 7% slower than the previous year, but still 5% faster than the average 20-year rate. Average CO2 concentration was 414 parts per million, and that is a 31% increase from 1960. Global air temperatures continued to be high. Temperatures were globally 0.85 degrees above the 30-year mean from 60 to 90, and that is the second highest in the historical record. The ozone hole returned to its normal size. It was 51% greater than previous year, but the previous year experienced an unusual polar circulation that led to a very small ozone hole. This year, its size was close to average 20-year values. Sea ice extent increased slightly. Compared to the 2019 record low, a 3% increase occurred. Ice was stable in the Arctic, but there was a slight increase in the Antarctic. The combined extent, however, is still 4% lower than the 20-year average. Summarizing, greenhouse gas pollution and warming slowed down slightly but continued. The ozone hole expanded to its normal size again. Australia's population continued to grow. Population reached 25.7 million, that is 17% above the 20-year average. Population growth did slow down slightly in 2020. Population increased by 188,000 people, that is 43% slower compared to the average 20-year growth rate. This was mainly because of reduced immigration due to COVID-19 border closures. Demand for space and materials increased slightly in 2020. The number of building approvals increased from 2019 after falling for 4 years in a row. The greatest relative increases were in the Northern Territory and Western Australia. However, new dwellings do not always involve land cover change, and they can replace already existing dwellings. Greenhouse gas emissions remain high. They decreased, however, by 3.2% from the previous year. They were 0.3% above the 20-year average. Decreases from previous year occurred in nearly all sectors, in waste, transport, fugitive and electricity generation, and also in agriculture and industry. The only increase was in direct combustion. Official government statistics state that land cover and land use change absorb more greenhouse gases than they emitted. Official accounting suggests that 17 megatons of CO2 equivalents was sequestered this way. That is because planted forest gains exceeded accounted forest removals. However, it's important to remember that that number excludes large emissions from drought and fire, for example. Greenhouse gas emissions per person fell. They were 3.9% lower than the previous year and 14% below the 20-year average. However, per capita emissions in Australia are still among the highest in the world. There were 20.6 tons CO2 equivalents, and that is 1.3 times greater than the US, 2.5 times greater than the European Union, and more than 4 times the world average. This is due to the high energy use in Australia, the burning of coal, and also the occurrence of non-CO2 emissions. In summary, population growth and carbon emissions were less than the previous year, but still high. Global ocean temperature was similar to the previous year. The ocean absorbs 93% of excess heat from climate change, and the top 700 meters of the oceans was 1.1% less hot than in 2019. However, it was still the second hottest year since record began, and there's a very clear increasing trend. Sea level also continued to rise steadily. Global sea level rose by 3.1 millimeters in 2020. That makes for 75 millimeters since 2000 and 98 millimeters since 1993. Sea level around the world is not uniform, however, and around Australia, the seas have been rising faster than the global average. The fastest rates are in the Tasman Sea, which has risen more than 150 millimeters since 1993. Ocean temperatures around Australia were higher than the previous year. They were 0.17 degrees above the 20-year average. That made it the equal fourth warmest year. They were also 0.59 degrees above the 20-year average. Marine heat waves did occur in 2020. Temperatures were particularly high in the tropical seas. Record high temperatures occurred in the Great Barrier Reef in February-March, and that heat caused a mass bleaching event in the Great Barrier Reef. It was the third mass bleaching event in 5 years, following similar events in 2016 and 17. It was measured that 25% of reefs were severely bleached, and this time the southern reef was also affected. Overall, the reef remains in poor condition. Bleaching occurred when the reef was already in a poor condition, and the bleaching doesn't appear to have changed that too much. Indeed, there are some indications that the species remaining after 2016 and 17 events may be more heat tolerant. In summary, the main event this year was a marine heat wave that caused a mass bleaching event in the Great Barrier Reef. Rainfall in 2020 was slightly above the average. The national average rainfall was 536 millimeters, and that is 79% more than the very dry previous year. It is also 10% above the 20-year average. Rainfall was normal across most of the country. It was above average in most of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, parts of inland of WA and Queensland, and it was the highest range since 2000 in coastal New South Wales. There was low rainfall across the top end of Capricornia as well as in parts of Western Australia. For Australia, the year was cooler than the previous very hot year, but still very much above average. The mean temperature across Australia was 0.43 degrees above the 20-year average and 1.15 degrees above the 30-year average from 1960 to 1990. Maximum temperatures during the year were also well above average. The average maximum temperature was 42.6 degrees. That is 0.66 degrees above the 20-year average. Very high maximum temperatures were measured in southern parts of Western Australia, New South Wales and Tasmania, and the ACT. And those temperatures were measured early in the year. Overall, there were fewer heat records that were broken in 2020. Penrith in Western Sydney experienced 48 degrees on the 4th of January. That made it its hottest day on record and made it also the hottest place on Earth that day. September and November were also unseasonably warm. There was an above average number of hot days. Hot days are defined here as days over 35 degrees. On average, there were 88 hot days in 2020 across the country. That makes it 9 days more than a 20-year average, or 11%. Minimum temperatures were also above the average. This is due to a combination of warming trends, greater cloud cover, and wetter soils. They were 0.81 degrees above the 20-year average. Frost occurrence was also 23% below the 20-year average. And there were warmer nights in most of Australia, but there were unusually cold June and August nights in South Australia and Western Victoria. Snow cover was below average. It was 24% below the 20-year average. It was below average in Victoria and New South Wales, but it was close to average in Tasmania. The Black Summer bushfires continued to cause bad air quality in early 2020. This is especially true in the southern New South Wales and ACT in January and February. Canberra even topped the world's list of towns with the most dangerous air quality in January 2020. In summary, hot and dry conditions continued until February, but returned to normal thereafter.
Early 2020 was the end of an unprecedented fire season. Bushfires continued in early 2020 with fire activity in southeast Australia and new fires in the southern New South Wales, eastern Victoria and the ACT in January and February. Nationally, the 17 million hectares burned in 2020 was unusually low and 90% below the 20 years average, which could be attributed to low fuel availability and prolonged dry conditions, as we will see later. The area burned in the ACT, New South Wales and Victoria in 2020 was less than in 2019, but still 2.2 times the 2019 average, and made up 30% of the national burn area in 2020. We found strong regional differences in terms of fire activity, with very low activity in inland Australia, which normally accounts for the largest areas and emissions, but high fire activity in Southeast Australia and other isolated areas. This high fire activity in Southeast Australia can be explained by very dry fuel together with hot weather. So we saw record low values along the East Coast in early 2020, but those values increased later in the year. Nationally, fuel was the driest since at least 2020, but as mentioned before, values in Southeast Australia increased later in the year following rainfall. Total fire carbon emissions were below average, more specifically 43% below the 2019 average and 53% less than in the previous year. Again, likely related to the low fuel activity and fuel availability in inland Australia. Unusually, but for the second year, the largest part of the emissions were originated from forest fires in Southeast Australia, mainly burning in January. Smoke and ashes produced by bushfires in Southeast Australia were observed as far as New Zealand. In summary, the Black Summer bushfire season continued until February 2020, but fire activity was very low otherwise.
National river inflows were below average in 2020. Total inflows were 66 millimeters, or about 500,000 gigalitres. That is 27% below the 20-year average, but it's 26% more than the previous year. Annual flows were close to normal in most catchments. There were very low flows in the top end and Capricornia, but there were very high flows in southern New South Wales and in the Nullarbor. There were major river floods in southern New South Wales in August. There were 400 millimeters of rain within 4 days, and that caused the worst flooding in the Shoalhaven River since 1991. There was flash flooding in southeast Queensland that happened in January and then again in December. It's a mixed story when it comes to the major irrigation reservoirs. In the Murray-Darling Basin, there was an increase from 35% to 57% of capacity thanks to good rains. That was last reached in 2018. On the other hand, in the Ord Reservoir, there was a decline from 34% to 29% of capacity. That marks the third year of decline of water storage there. Urban water supplies increased for all major cities. They went from half full to almost full capacity in Sydney and Canberra, but there were also smaller improvements in Melbourne and in Adelaide, and even smaller improvements, almost nearly stable conditions in Brisbane and in Perth. The extent of wetland flooding remained low. Total inundation increased slightly from 2019, but was at similar levels as the previous 2 years, 2018-2019, and still 20% below the 20-year average. If you look by catchment, we also see that wetland extent was average or below average. It was the lowest since 2000 in the Ord, Murchison and Albany catchments in Western Australia, but also in several Murray tributaries and in Gippsland in Victoria. On the other hand, there were the highest wetland extents since 2000 in several smaller catchments in Western Australia, on the east coast and in Western Tasmania. In summary, river flows and wetland conditions did improve in 2020, but they remained well below average in most catchments. Soil moisture values returned to normal in 2020 across most of the country. Nationally, the top 6 meter moisture availability increased to about average. There was 31 millimeters or 9% more than in the previous year, 2019, and it's 3% less than the long-term average. When we look at different regions, we see the strongest increases on the New South Wales coast, in the Northern Territory, and in the Kimberley region. The biggest decreases occurred in North Queensland and in some inland regions, here in yellow. Soil moisture in Southeast Australia increased early in the year. There was high rainfall in February and March and sustained regular rainfall since. And that has helped change from the dry conditions to the more normal conditions in this part of Australia. Northern Australia returned from unusually dry to more normal conditions. That is partly due to the late arrival of the 2019-20 monsoon, which got some good rains in the latter part of the season. And then, again, the 2021 monsoon started in December with good rains. The decline in Queensland was because conditions returned to normal after being particularly wet in 2019. Values were therefore lower in 2019, but still average because of good rainfall in February and in December. Despite good rains, much soil was still left exposed, similar to the previous year. Soil protection by vegetation and litter remained poor across most of Australia. It was 1% better than previous year, but still 11% worse than the 20-year average. There was ongoing poor soil condition in inland Australia. It was the worst since at least 2000 in inland southwest WA, in Kangaroo Island, and in the southeast corner, here in dark red. In summary, soil moisture generally recovered to more normal levels, but soil protection remained poor. Nationally, vegetation recovered to more normal values. There was 7% more vegetation than the previous year, and it was 4% below the long-term average. Vegetation did remain quite poor across most of WA, here in dark red. It was the poorest since at least 2000 in a large part of southern WA, as well as in the southeast corner of Australia due to the fires that occurred there. There were improved conditions in inland Southeast Australia. Nationally, vegetation growth rate returned to close to normal. Vegetation growth or carbon uptake is estimated from weather and satellite data. It was 21% higher than the previous year and 1% above the 20-year average. Growth conditions were poor in the west but very good in the southeast. They were the best growth conditions since at least 2000 in New South Wales tablelands, and that has helped drive the mouse plague that has been in the news recently. On the other hand, there have been poor growth conditions in large swathes of the inland. Overall, cropping conditions were good, while grazing conditions were about average. When we look at vegetation productivity, in grazing land it was 3% above the 20-year average, in irrigation it was 24% above it, and in dryland cropping 25% above it, so good conditions there, particularly in East Australia. However, there were still below average conditions in Western Australia. Forest and natural vegetation on average remained in poor condition. In native and plantation forestry, we saw that productivity was 9% below the 20-year average, and natural environments was 6% below the long-term average. That is mainly due to drought in the inland and fire on the coast. National tree cover recovered slightly from the low values in the previous year. The total canopy of cover of vegetation above 2 meters was estimated to be 13% greater than in 2019, which amounts to about 7 million hectares if you were to add it all up. That is 1% less than the average 20-year value. There was good tree recovery in northern states, and that exceeded the losses from bushfire in the south. That explains why total tree cover still went up despite the fires. Nationally, the greatest increases were on grazing land with almost 5 million hectares, about 1 million hectares in natural environments, and another 0.7 million hectares on cropping land. However, there were also 46,000 hectares of tree cover lost from plantation forests. Summarizing, on a national scale, vegetation conditions returned to close to normal, but there were strong regional differences.
So what does the physical state of Australia's environment mean for biodiversity? In a nutshell, biodiversity continued to decline in 2020 despite the eased drought conditions. Many Australian ecosystems have been pushed to their limits of natural resilience, and while some may recover, others will have been irreparably damaged. We don't currently have a comprehensive way to survey Australian biodiversity, so in lieu of that we use a series of indicators, including the threatened species listing, rapid survey methods such as aerial surveys of waterbirds, bioindicators, species such as flying foxes that tell us about the community at large, citizen science, and disturbance mapping. The threatened species list is currently the closest metric we have for accounting for Australia's threatened species and how they're faring. There are now 1,902 threatened species in Australia. In 2020, 15 species were added to the list and 3 species were removed, and we'll discuss them later. Whilst this is a modest increase of less than 1% on last year, each year of modest increases has steadily risen the list by 508 species since the year 2000. In 2020, no additional species were listed as extinct, leaving the official total at 91. However, the real total of extinct species is predicted to be well over 100. Most of Australia's threatened species are plants, and in general, they're declining. Monitoring data compiled by the Threatened Plant Index found that threatened plants have declined over the last 2 decades by around 70%. So what changes were made to the threatened species list in 2020? Well, in some good news, 3 species were removed from the list. These species were formerly 2 endangered frogs and 1 vulnerable plant. The frogs were waterfall frogs, Litoria nonotus, and mist frogs, Litoria rheacola. They were initially listed in the year 2000, primarily due to chytrid fungus, an invasive pathogen fungus species, and habitat loss. In 2015 to 17, surveys of these frog species found that they had recovered and expanded into sites from which they had previously been lost. They now occupy extensive habitat in the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area. And this is really promising news because it shows that some frog species are able to recover from chytrid. Added to the list were a variety of species, including a pair of species, a soft coral and a seahorse that relies on it. The coral is a 2-metre tall pink coral found in a restricted part of New South Wales, around Port Stephens, and it's undergoing decline. It is the habitat for the white seahorse, and both were listed in 2020 as endangered. Their declines are related to anchor damage and coastal development. 4 species were uplisted, that is, they were classed as more endangered than they previously were. And one of these species is the Australian sea lion. It was uplisted from vulnerable to endangered, and is one of the most endangered members of the seal family in the world. There's only about 12,000 of them remaining. Several species were either discovered or rediscovered in 2020, and the following is just a snapshot of some of them. A Norfolk Island land snail called Advena campbelli, which was thought to be extinct, was rediscovered during snail surveys on the island. 3 other species of the estimated 30 Norfolk Island land snails have gone extinct, and this is largely due to predation by black rats. Another species rediscovered was a rare bee that was last seen in 1923 and rediscovered in not 1 but 3 populations by a Flinders University researcher in Queensland. Apart from these 2 rediscoveries of species thought extinct, there were also some new species discovered in 2020. The greater glider, which was formerly one species, has been split into 3 distinct species, northern, central and southern, due to new genetic evidence. The bushfires have pushed many threatened species closer to extinction, both by directly killing them and by destroying critical habitat. Around 6 million hectares of threatened species habitat burnt, and subsequently, 50 threatened animals have been listed as needing priority intervention. Overall, 13% of Australia's threatened species had at least 5% of their range burnt, and on the graph on the slide you'll be able to see other categories of burnt percentages for threatened species. Aside from the already listed threatened species, it is expected that more species will become threatened because of the fires. 70 non-threatened species have been listed as needing priority intervention, some of which may have become threatened. Plants were badly affected. 29 of the 30 species that had more than 80% of the range burnt were plants. And 191 species of invertebrates were severely affected and require urgent management. Early in the fire season, headlines were made with an estimate that 1 billion animals were killed. Well, that figure has now been revised to 3 billion either killed or displaced. The majority of these were reptiles. Reptiles tend to live in higher population densities in the affected area than other animals. Some post-fire recovery has been documented, and citizen science has helped that process. Using the Australian Museum Frog ID app, citizen scientists found that all of the 33 summer breeding frogs, so the ones that are calling, that had been detected in fire areas before the fires were detected after. So this is really good news for those species. It's also a great example of where citizen science can be rapidly mobilised and fill the gap until traditional biodiversity surveys can be carried out. However, for the non-calling frogs, we still don't know how they're faring after the fires. In some places, the natural resilience to fire is high, and in these places, they may recover. In others, however, they may never return to their pre-fire state. This is particularly the case for species that cannot bounce back, and in places where the gap between fires has been too small. To aid recovery, the government has put aside $200 million for wildlife and habitats. When much needed rain hit New South Wales in February and March, this eased drought conditions and allowed a lot of inland birds to breed. The rain attracted good numbers of inland species like budgerigars. Data from the Atlas of Living Australia shows a striking movement of budgies in 2020. They're usually patchily across the interior of the country, and in this year they descended upon the areas that received rainfall in southeastern Australia. Budgies were even seen in low numbers in the ACT, where they are usually a rare visitor. Another notable bird movement and breeding has been of quails and button quails. There have been very few records of button quails over the last few years in New South Wales because of the drought conditions, but since the February rains, they've been breeding in a number of sites. Another metric are water bird numbers. In 2020, we saw a small decrease in the number of birds since last year, and this remains lower than the long-term average. Additionally, breeding was much lower than last year and was essentially restricted to just black swans, who comprised 81% of the total breeding. So for Australia's water birds, the above average rainfall at the start of the year was not enough for substantial recovery after the record-breaking drought of 2016 to 2019. In summary, Australian biodiversity continued to decline despite above average rainfall easing the drought conditions. Some fire-adapted ecosystems may recover, but others will never return to their pre-fire state.
We'll now look at some key indicators of Australia's environment. We'll look at them as changes compared to the 20-year average, but noting that sometimes that can be part of a longer-term trend, and sometimes it can be mostly natural variability. The ozone hole was 1% greater than the 20-year average. There still appears to be the trend towards a smaller ozone hole, however. When we look at ocean temperature, it increased, the population increased, mean temperatures increased, and the days over 35 degrees, the number of hot days also increased in 2020. These indicators are all part of increasing long-term trends. Rainfall was 9% above the long-term average. There's no obvious trend on a national scale, but there is natural variability. The amount of biomass burned was much below the longer-term average. That is mainly because of the dry conditions and the lack of fuel in inland Australia. River flows were 27% below average, reflecting dry starting conditions as well as the limited amount of rain in some parts of Australia. Similar to river flows, wetlands were well below the long-term average. Soil moisture was fairly close to the long-term average thanks to good rains. Soil protection was still below average because the soil and the vegetation did not fully respond to the improved soil moisture conditions. Leaf area was a little bit below the long-term average. Plant growth was a little bit above average. Tree cover was slightly below average. And the amount of threatened species was 16% greater than long-term average, again being part of a longer-term steady increase in the number of threatened species. So overall, when we look at these indicators, we see a combination of long-term trends and natural variability. We see that the ozone hole is still slowly repairing itself. We see that temperatures continue to increase. We see the number of threatened species continues to increase, as well as the population and the associated pressure on our environment. And on top of that, we see a recovery from the very dry 2019 thanks to above average rainfall in 2020, but that recovery has been patchy and hasn't affected all parts of Australia's environment equally, at least not yet. We now take a look at the environmental condition scores. The environmental condition scores combine 7 environmental indicators and calculates a score out of 10. We can do that for every region, but at national scale, the environmental condition score increased 2.6 points from the extremely low value in 2019 to 3.1 in 2020. That marks the third year of below average conditions. Scores did increase in most states and territories. Except for a small decline in Tasmania, there were large increases to above average conditions in New South Wales and Victoria. And despite slight improvements, there were still poor scores in Western Australia and the Northern Territory. There were also still below average conditions in South Australia, Queensland, the ACT, and Tasmania. In summary, the overall environmental conditions did improve in 2020, but they were still below average across most of the country. To read the summary report, to see the scorecard for your own region, or to find more details on how the numbers here were derived and where they came from, please visit www.ausen.online. Thanks for watching.